Hello, and welcome to part 3 in the series, The State of America's Beef Industry. Now, in part 1, we talked about how the concentration in the marketplace exploded from 1980 to 2021, and how that explosion in concentration resulted in a complete reversal of the allocation of the consumer's beef dollar to each participant in the beef supply chain. And in part 2, we discussed how the government allowed the beef packers to form a tight oligopoly with access to imported beef and cattle from around the world, resulting in fewer opportunities for domestic producers that caused the domestic cattle industry to shrink. And we ended with the statement that 15 years ago, the U.S. cow herd shrank to a level too low to allow the cattle industry to withstand even a moderate economic shock. And in late 2010, such a moderate economic shock struck, a widespread drought that occurred while the cattle herd was already in the liquidation phase of the cattle cycle, which had started back in 2008. The drought accelerated America's herd liquidation, and by 2014, the U.S. cow herd was at the smallest level in about 70 years. And while the U.S. cow herd was shrinking, America's appetite for beef was increasing, as was their willingness to pay higher prices for beef. So during this period, beef supplies were tight, and both cattle prices and beef prices were increasing, with beef prices peaking at over $6 per pound for the first time in history in 2015. Now, the rising beef and cattle prices signaled to the cattle industry that it should expand, and it was everyone's expectation that cattle prices would remain strong for at least another 3 years due to the industry's long biological cycle. But while the cattle industry was beginning to hold back heifers and expand, the volume of beef and cattle imports exploded in 2014 and 2015, hitting a 13-year high in 2015. Now, the weight of this surge in undifferentiated imports contributed to the inexplicable collapse in cattle prices, which fell further and faster than at any time in history, thwarting the domestic industry's opportunity to rebuild the domestic cow herd in alignment with America's growing appetite for beef. This resulted in an alarming aberration. Our cow herd was expanding while cattle prices were swiftly falling. And then the unexpected happened. While consumer beef prices initially fell in the face of collapsing cattle prices, they soon resumed their upward climb and continued to climb even while cattle prices were trending downward, creating the widest spread in history between cattle prices and beef prices. And this lasted for about 5 years. Without a doubt, beginning around 2017 and continuing until very recently, consumers were paying inflated beef prices while cattle prices were suppressed. This was a classic example of severe market failure. Beef prices and cattle prices could not head in opposite directions for such an extended period of time if the market was competitive. The historical relationship between the price of cattle and the price of beef was severed. Clearly, the tight oligopolistic marketplace was exploiting farmers and ranchers on one end of the supply chain and consumers on the other. And the 2002 agricultural census shows that during the period from 2017 to 2022, over 106,000 beef cattle operations and over 2.5 million mother cows were purged from the U.S. cattle industry. Oligopolistic power, amplified by rising imports, created a dysfunctional market that thrust the cow herd back into a liquidation phase. And almost immediately after the cow herd began liquidating, another economic shock struck. A second widespread drought that again accelerated the ongoing liquidation of the cow herd from late 2020 through 2022. All the while the cow herd was liquidating, consumer beef demand was strengthening, and consumers continued demonstrating a willingness to pay more and more for beef. Import volumes exploded again, hitting an all-time high in 2023, a new high in 2024, and yet another new high in 2025. While import volumes were surging, consumer beef prices, which had been hitting year-over-year highs since 2017, continued their year-over-year increases, reaching $9.55 for all fresh beef and over $10 per pound for choice beef in December 2025. Amazingly, despite mounting record volumes of imports, which have historically driven domestic cattle prices downward, the dangerously low level of cattle inventory in the face of historically strong beef demand eventually set cattle prices free from the forces that had been suppressing them, and cattle prices began chasing beef prices skyward. Well, with that, I'm Bill Bullard with RCAF USA. the voice of the independent cattle and sheep producer in the United States of America. Have a productive week and watch for episode 4 next week. Thank you.